Om Vang me manasi pratisthita mano me vachi pratishthitam aviravirmaidhi vedasya ma'anistha shrutam me ma prahasihi anena dhitena horatran samdadhami haritam vadashyami satyam vadashyami tanmamavatu tadvaktaramavatu avatu mam avatu vaktaram avatu vaktaram. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
In some of the sessions that you have done previously with Radhe and Penny, that I have gotten the recordings of from Radhe and have been listening to, and I have some thoughts and some questions about those. So you've already gone over it with them. How would you like me to deal with that? Would you like me to email you my thoughts, or?
No, the best way if we discuss it, and if you have certain questions, concerns, we can go back to it, and it will always link to what we are doing, because it's one kind of big knowledge.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that, because there seems to be a progression in what you're offering in terms of starting at the beginning of the Rig Veda with the first Richa.
Yeah. Please tell me your concerns or thoughts or inquiries, whatever it is, now before we start with the hymn, and I will link it definitely to the hymn if we go to it.
Well, specifically, I was thinking about the quest of the. Is that all right with you, Radhe?
Absolutely.
The presentation that you made about how the one, the wholeness, the oneness could ever be separate, how it could ever be two or multiple.
Right.
And the way that I've been taught, and has been my experience, is that the way that happens is that the one whose nature, whose constituent nature is consciousness, and because of its absolute fundamental nature as consciousness, as soon as it becomes conscious of itself, consciousness becomes aware of itself, then immediately you have a dynamic where there's a knower and a process of knowing and an object. And as soon as, even though all of those things initially are one, consciousness being conscious of consciousness, as soon as you have that, by its very nature, it becomes three, which is in essence is duality. And as soon as you have duality, then you have the creation that's creating itself out of itself, and it's by virtue of its own constituent nature as consciousness itself. So it doesn't duplicate itself; it knows itself.
What you're saying is absolutely right. You're speaking only philosophical language, and if I shift to philosophical paradigm and speak within the framework of this paradigm you are talking, I will speak the same language as you speak, and would totally agree with you, with everything you say.
Well, it's also when you said psychological in the sense, and because the knower is the rishi,
Mm-hmm.
and the knowing is the devata, and the known is chandas, and yet they're all Veda.
I would agree with your re-articulating terms in a different fashion, and maybe we will have to figure out what you mean by the Veda, by Chandas, by every word, because you're using terms now which are kind of occupied within the system. And you shifted the meanings of those terms towards your own usage, which is good. Only I want to know what you mean by Chandas now, what you mean by Veda, and then I will say whether I agree or not. I like your previous presentation on the consciousness, so to say, reflecting upon itself and creating the world by that. It is very much phenomenological language, which I kind of subscribe to. I like it and understand it well.
And doesn't it say that also he created the world and then he entered into it?
Right. Now, when we come to the Vedic vision and we say that he created this world and entered it himself by himself, again, what do we really mean, himself by himself? What self, by what self he entered? And here we have a problem, because if we want to mentally solve this paradox, then we would be kind of going into the depth of our philosophical thinking, as, for example, Heidegger did, or somebody went deep into that kind of trouble to explain everything out of the one, how this many appeared. Now, Vedic paradigm gives us a much easier solution, which is more concrete, much easier, because what it does, it creates two stages of creation, and it shows that actually the habitat in which our consciousness lives was the first creation, and the consciousness which entered this habitat was the second creation. And that's why we have the relation between our consciousness and our habitat, our body. Our body is not our consciousness per se. There is some distance from our consciousness, and that distance has to be explained psychologically. So that's why we have the soul within us, which is more conscious, and the body, which is less conscious. I mean, when I say body, I mean physical, vital, and mental bodies. I don't mean only physicality.
You just think that your body is your consciousness that's kind of crystallized.
It is, in a way. It will be the result of it, at least at the end, and we will see that this body is nothing but the being which is conscious. But to come to that point, to evolve to that being, one has, yeah, you have to see the difference. And how would we do that difference? Through the word, or through the mind, or through what? What do we have really in hand to do that? And that is a big question. So we can use different languages, but we have to see the difference between paradigms. By the way, we did this exercise with Radhe, and we tried to look into the systems, so into different paradigms, the shift of paradigms, from the Vedic to post-Vedic to rational structure of consciousness. We looked into it from the Gebserian point of view of shifts of structures of consciousness, which was useful because we can now use different languages. I don't mind using rational language, which you are using now. You're using a rational language of mental structure, which I like. We can go into it, but you have to see that it is not in opposition to any other language. At least Gebser says that the mental structure of consciousness is very aggressive and very exclusive and demands its own only approach. And it is true, because when I was mental, philosophical, I was very precise and tolerating very little of any other mythological or any other thought. For example, I never could accept shamanistic tradition or, oneness of nature feeling. That was for me non-existent. It was something which I would make fun of. But now, having learned a little more about different languages, I can see that everybody tries to explain the whole vision in terms of that instrument he has at hand. So if you offer this instrument, we can go with it, but that would not be Vedic. It would be philosophical or psychological, of mental structure of today, that oneness produced out of itself, the reflection upon itself, the two which made the three, and arithmetically it would be so that we could come to, for example, Daoism, to Lao Tzu, who said that one created two, two created three, and three created all number of things. So three is already a multitude of things. But two is a reflection upon itself. And this reflection upon itself, as you are saying, mathematically, is the third one. And the third one is emanation of all the multitudinous of things. Yeah.
So, but basically, it's not really philosophical. It's still Upanishadic, if you will, or Vedic, in the sense that it all boils down to all of those emanations are nothing but the one in the first place.
Sure. So I agree with you totally. You are speaking the same thing. But what was here in this Vedic? What did you find useful for yourself or not useful? Please, can you tell me this? Have you been through it?
Do I find, excuse me?
Have you seen this presentation?
I think I started seeing that.
Right. So at the beginning was the self. Yeah, I take Shatapatha Brahmana's text because it is fitting to our thinking. At the beginning was the self. Atman was at the beginning, alone, as it is said. Now that's why I'm using this picture, the sun in the darkness, alone Atman. He was alone. Now he looked around and didn't find anybody except himself. It's a strange kind of thing. He looked around, yes? Where around if there was nobody but him? And he looked around himself and found nobody else but himself. So, and it is interesting why that movement to look around and find nobody but himself is already kind of telling us that he was looking for someone else than himself. But he found only himself, as you rightly say. He, consciousness alone, or the being was alone. Atman is the being, not consciousness. But looked around is consciousness. Looked around is consciousness. So being looked for somebody and found only being, only oneself. And then he said, I am, but there was no other name to say, for he was alone. So there was no, I am that, I am this. He couldn't say who he was because there was nobody, there was no predicate. There was only I and am. Yes? There was only reflection upon its own being by his own consciousness. And then I will not go into the whole hymn, I'm cutting it short. There are 3 dots here. There are many interesting things in between, but we don't have time, and it is not essential for here. He was not happy. This is the end of the passage. He wanted another. And it is very, very interesting. Naiva reme in Sanskrit. He was not happy. Sadvitiyam aichad. He wanted the second, another. I am putting another because I like this concept, but it was the second, dvitiyam aichad. In another text we have that he wanted to become many. Bahusyam, he said. May I be many. How could he who alone was become many? Can you imagine this kind of treatment of yourself? You alone are, you look around, there is nothing, nobody, only you, everywhere, only one thing is you. You who has no name, no form, nothing, only you everywhere. And then how could you, this thing, become many? What would you do? Actually, we have this memory because we all belong to that one. We know what he did. Psychologically we know it. We really had this experience, and we have this memory deeply rooted in our being.
Absolutely.
So what would you do? What would be your suggestion? How can you who alone are become many?
Well, I think it's quite inadvertent. I think and this is kind of what the experience is. If you are and you're sitting in yourself, as soon as you have the awareness that you're knowing yourself, then all the thoughts start coming from that, because it's just when you're just sitting in the self, you're sitting in wholeness, and it's transcendental, and it's just pure. There's nothing there. It's just pure. As soon as you start knowing, oh, I'm sitting in the transcendent, then as soon as you think that, then all of a sudden the whole thing multiplies, and it goes on and on and on. It just happens that way because it's its nature, because it's the nature of being to become.
Yeah, now you presume things. You see, this is the I want you not to presume. I want to be totally honest to what we have. We don't have anything of what you said. You presume that it is the nature of things, that there will be multitudes coming in. You presume all these things. I don't presume a thing. I know that I am alone, and there is no other name to say because I am alone, and I don't have that what you say. I don't have this flood of things in my mind. I don't have mind. I don't have thought. What he said here, it's a symbolic saying. He said he wanted to express himself as something, and there was nothing to express because he was alone. So he came back to his own self-awareness. When you say that he becomes self-aware, it is here. He is fully self-aware. I am. He knows. By his own consciousness, he knows that he is totally alone is. Yeah, he knows that by consciousness. So he has full self-awareness. He is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. He is everything. There is nothing he cannot do. He can do anything and everything, but how? The question, how he would become another if he alone is. If you alone are, how could you become another, another, an other? Not yourself. Can you become not yourself? This is a fundamental issue. It's ontological issue. It's not.
Well, it's one of those. It's part of the paradox because it's part of the paradox of the because you can't be another, but that's what we experience. That's what we experience until we remember that we aren't many, we are only one. But we experience that we're other, but the reality is that there isn't any other, and there has never been any other.
So you mean to say that he wanted to become another? It means he wanted to play another. He didn't want to be another.
Well, it didn't say he wanted to be another. I mean, it said he wanted another. He wanted Dvitiya. He can't ever, there's no way you can ever really be another, right? Ever?
Are you sure about this? You're sure because you're thinking from yourself as you alone are. That's why you think so. You cannot be another. But he wanted another. He wanted to be many. Bahusyam. What does it mean, Bahusyam, many? You see, when I was in India and discussed this issue... Exactly. When I was in India and discussed this issue, everyone, every Hindu, Brahmin, philosopher, yogin, told me the same thing. It's Leela. It's only Leela. It is the Shiva closing his eyes and then opening them and saying, "Oh, I am still here." It is, Krishna sucking his toe and playing with these kind of things with himself and saying, "Oh, I am kind of different," with toys. He becomes toys to himself to play with and thinking that it is as if another, but it is not another, it is him. I think he really wanted to be many, and he wanted really to become to himself another self. And that's why the maniness appeared. Maniness is not an illusion. It's not only a phenomenon, it is also a reality. And now here we come to this, what I think truly Vedic paradigm is about. It is not about an illusion of many, an illusion of this nature, which is only one spirit, Brahman, behind, and we all belong to Brahman, and that's why all these varieties of things are non-existent or partially existent only in our phenomenological consciousness. Do you believe that this multitude of things is only an illusion?
I think I guess it's different states of awareness or different orders of reality. And it depends on what you inhabit, where you are in the whole thing. Because I think there's an ultimate thing, an ultimate reality, which is just oneness, which is just I am, and that's the ultimate reality. But certainly all of us who are embodied and all of us who function know that there certainly is there certainly is a reality which is multiplicity and change and constant change and constant birth and death and all of the other things. We experience that. It's just a different order of reality. And it's a different state of consciousness.
Yeah. Let us presume that what he wanted was real. He wanted to be many. He wanted to be another. And he wanted to have another, if you like. You like it more to have another. And which is not totally correct, but it's all right for now. But how? How one can become another? Is there a way to do it? What would you do if you alone were there and there was no space, no time, only you? What would you do? I will move to another slide. Sri Aurobindo asks, why should Brahman, who is perfect, absolute, infinite, needing nothing, desiring nothing, at all throw out force of consciousness to create in itself these worlds of forms? It's a very valid question. Why that who is perfect, needing nothing, infinite, absolute, desiring nothing, do something within itself to create these forms, these worlds of forms? What for? If then, being free to move or remain eternally still, to throw itself into forms or retain the potentiality of form in itself, it indulges its power of movement and formation, it can be only for one reason, for delight.
I was going to say for love.
Yes, it is for this delight which is overwhelming within itself. When consciousness is totally realizing its being, pure, it has a fullness of delight, and it wants to throw it out and to multiply it and to have more delight and have more delight and even more delight. And how would you have more delight than you could have out of this infinite being? You can have even more delight, and about this Sri Aurobindo and the mother, they speak, and it's quite interesting what they say.
So is this delight, is this bhaga?
Yeah, in the Veda it is bhaga, yes. Now, this delight is an emanation of the conscious being, of this Atman who knows himself. It emanates, it overflows, and this overflowing may create the world. But how to create another? The Supreme, says the mother, decided to exteriorize himself, objectivize himself. He was a pure subject, in order to have the joy of knowing himself in detail, to be able to see himself. He didn't see himself yet. He looked around and didn't find anybody. He wanted to see objectively.
Is this drishti? I mean, which seeing are we talking about? Pasha or drishti, or what kind of seeing are we talking?
We are talking about objectivizing, seeing oneself as objectively existing being. That means as another. When you see objectively existing being, you are already another.
Right.
So the first thing in himself, what he exteriorized, was the knowledge of the world and the power to create it. There has to be some movement within himself which would emanate this thing, which would become another. And this knowledge consciousness, this chit tapas, yes, or this chit shakti and force began its work. And in the Supreme Will, there was a plan. And the first principle of this plan was the expression of both, the essential joy and the essential freedom, which he has in himself, so to say, which seemed to be the most interesting feature of this creation. So here how he became another, the first creation, the eternal night. Now, in order for this being who alone is infinite, needing nothing, emanating only joy of his and freedom of his own being and consciousness and delight, how that thing would become another thing? He has to separate himself from himself. he has to have a border, or he has to forget himself, that he will be another than he is now. He has to forget himself. And this is where the eternal night comes in the Veda, and that's why it is so important in the Vedic vision to see this.
What is the term for the eternal night in the Veda?
Ratri.
Ratri, okay.
How is that different than Nakta?
It is not very different. Ratri or Nakta or... And what is interesting about this, but there are even deeper words like abhava, the abyss of inconscient, yeah, and so on. In the Veda also, there are many different terms. Yes, non-being, so to say, where the being is lost completely. There is nothing to be known. So in order to become another, he had to separate his awareness from himself, so to say. He had to lose or to forget himself.
Yes.
And this forgetfulness is translated in terms of this eternal night, which he was. So if in the Bible the God says, let it be light, in the Veda the God says, let it be night, because he is light. It's kind of interesting. And so night, says the Veda, was born out of the shining truth of the supreme power. From the night the waters of the inconscient came into being, and from the waters of the inconscient the time was born, the creator of all that moves. Now we have the dynamism, the time coming in through the negation of oneself, of one's own self-awareness, not of the being. You cannot negate the being, but you can negate your awareness of yourself. And so to say, you can deny your self-awareness to yourself and not the being. I will have to find better words for this.
I understand.
So this night, out of himself he cast the luminous shadow, all these worlds, from the superconscient to the inconscient, these emanations, so to say, from the center, gradually denying himself, withdrawing his supreme knowledge or supreme awareness from his supreme power, becoming unaware of these worlds as himself, though it is he still.
Jnana Shakti and Kriya Shakti? Or is those, it's a different...
Yeah, it's a different paradigm. We will come to it a little later. Once we finish with the vision, you will define yourself afterwards. But
supreme knowledge is what?
It is awareness. I am.
No, I know what it is, but what's the word?
Is it chit?
In the Veda there are many words for this. Chetas, prachetas, vichetas. Chetana is consciousness which is rather embodied. But I would not go into etymology. I want you to have a principle first. Later I will give you many words, too many really, and they would give you also the whole different picture, which is much more complex. Now we are looking into the principle. What has happened to this, where this duality is coming from, as you were rightly putting. The question was where this duality is coming from. Here you can see the first duality. It comes from the denial of his own self-awareness to himself. He withdrew his supreme knowledge, his self-awareness from his supreme power, from his being, and let being be without awareness. And that is darkness. He withdrew the light from his being and let being be without light. So, what is interesting, this is from Aitareya, we will come to Aitareya later. And here I'm using Sri Aurobindo's words, which are describing this very beautifully from his poem, in the enigma of the darkened vasts, in the passion and self-loss of the infinite, a contradiction founds the base of life. The eternal, the divine reality has faced itself with its own contraries. Being became the void, and conscious force nescience, and walk of a blind energy, and ecstasy took the figure of world pain. Now you see how all these Satchit Ananda, that in infinite eternal bliss, turned into its opposite. Being became the void, the conscious force nescience, and walk of a blind energy. Energy is there, but it is blind. It cannot see. It cannot know its being, its truth, its existence. And ecstasy of that fully self-aware being took figure of the world pain, of suffering. So here we have this turn into its opposite. In the mother story, actually this is a very interesting story from occultism, from Chaldean tradition, but she brings it into the Vedic, and Sri Aurobindo finds it very useful for the Vedic, for the very archaic vision. You see the Supreme Being here standing behind, and has four emanations, which is Satchit, Ananda and Vijnana, yes? So what we call Satchit Ananda, transcendental world. So being conscious and blissful and truthful. So all these four emanations turn into opposite in the mother's story. So they were given freedom to manifest the divine or to create another, and everyone was aware of himself, so to say, of his own supreme knowledge and power, and decided to move in his own free way, and kind of separated himself, as Mother says, from the source more and more, and turned into complete opposite. But it is another language of the same. So there were these four emanations: consciousness in light, which fell first, then bliss, then truth, and life. All these four emanations. Consciousness in light is Chit, and bliss is Ananda, truth is Vijnana, and life is Sat. And what is interesting is that Sat, the being, the divine being, falls last. The Sat, which is the divine existence, it is here the last being on the right, falls into its opposite, death, the last. So these were the four emanations according to the mother story. These fallen, you see at the bottom we have the darkness, the consciousness in light turned into darkness, the bliss turned into suffering, truth turned into falsehood, and life into death. And at the bottom we have these symbols, four symbols, so to say, forgetting their origin themselves, turning into their opposite. So if I would analyze it now from that first perspective about which we are talking, so this darkness is nothing but light, which forgot about its supreme belonging, its supreme awareness. Light which separated itself from its awareness, separated itself from the Supreme, becomes darkness. Bliss which separated itself from the Supreme, that oneness, that Atman, becomes suffering. So suffering is nothing but bliss, which forgot about its supreme belonging, about where it belongs. And falsehood is nothing but truth, and death is nothing but life. which forgot about its self-awareness, separated itself in knowledge from that Supreme Being. So basically these fallen emanations represent this consciousness in light, bliss, truth, and being here. They are the same divine emanations, only fallen emanations. Now, it's a very important passage because it explains to us who are these asuras, where they are coming from, why the asuras are considered to be the elder brothers of the gods, because gods are not yet here, they are not born yet. These are only first emanations. Those which we will be studying later in the Veda, you will see them very clearly. So, the second creation. So when the first involution took place, says the Veda, and the light turned into darkness, the creation became as if unsteady. It could not sustain itself. It is said as shithilamiva, adhruvamiva. It became not steady, shithilam, shaky, as if. It could not be, it could not stay, because it wasn't. It wasn't in its own self-awareness. It was not. It was being which was not in its self-awareness. So it didn't know what it was. It could not sustain itself. So the Supreme Self had to enter and to support it from within, the Veda says. When he entered himself by himself, Atmanatmanam abhisam vivesha, the creation became steady. It's a very significant thing. So to say, that which was denied in its self-awareness could not be. It is not. And in order for that non-being be, the being had to enter it and to sustain it from within.
So that is to say, it's always there, and it's always been there. It's hidden. It's been hidden.
Right. When all was plunged in the negating void, non-being's night could never have been saved if being had not plunged into the dark. I don't think anybody can say better than this. Even Veda doesn't speak so well, as Sri Aurobindo sometimes says in his poetry. When all was plunged in the negating void, non-being's night could never have been saved if being had not plunged into the dark. Yeah, it's beautiful. And non-being's night could never have been saved. So basically, it is not only saved from its own non-being, but also saved as it is, as a formation of itself. So non-being would disappear if the being would not be present within it. So for some reason, this non-being's night had to be preserved, had to be sustained for the evolutionary need in the future, that separate being, separate self could evolve within it. Separate being could become, finally, what he wanted to be.
So you wonder if that's maybe what the gods are after when in the yajna.
Right. Now you will see very differently yajna. We will change our views on yajna, on sacrifice, on everything what is happening here. From this point of view, everything which is separated is valuable and very wanted by this oneness. It wants to be many. It's its purpose. It is not wanting to be one. It is one, but it wants to become many. It's a very difficult task to do.
Why do you think that the diversity is so uncomfortable for people?
because we don't have oneness. If we would have oneness, as rishis had, we would love diversity. And they loved diversity. Actually, the whole Indian tradition loves diversity because of that. Because they have, in their basis, they have oneness. So to say, they presume oneness and look for diversity, and we presume diversity and look for oneness. And that's why these are two different, so to say, mindsets, you know, Western and Eastern. They have oneness already, Vedic oneness, and they are looking for this diversity as valuable, precious thing. They want to have these stars, you know, these varieties of manifestations. And this is very beautiful. It's another view on the world. Because it is only him, but him in terms of those details, of those, you know, which he wanted to manifest, infinite details of himself. That's why nothing is here identical in this world. We can't find two identical leaves from the tree, or two identical pebbles from the ocean, or two identical fingerprints, you know. Nothing is identical here. Everything is different. The infinite variety of things, all different. Is it not beautiful? It's in itself, it's a very beautiful. Yes.
Sorry, I'm back.
So we are talking about this diversity and why it is so important and where it is coming from. And the rishis were looking at this diversity as the most valuable manifestation of the divine in all the details. And that's a bit different view than we are looking at, as if this nature is a, you know, is a maya or illusion and we have to leave it. It's nonsense. It is really embodying and manifesting the divine in all the infinite varieties. And it's very beautiful, and we have to learn to love it. But for that we have to have that oneness, understanding where we are coming from and what we are looking for here. Okay, so in the mother's story, in order to repair the fall of the first emanations, these first, which fell into their opposite, the Supreme Mother Aditi delegated out of herself the force of love, which has plunged into the darkness of the first creation. In the Vedas it is Agni, the divine will, and the first avatar who lay down and hid himself within the darkness, the immortal among mortals. It is because of his presence that everyone is evolving, seeking after the higher knowledge of the Supreme. So this Agni, this fire, flame, which is coming from the depth of the inconscient, from the waters of the inconscient ocean, is rising to heaven, always moving upward, trying to move upward the whole nature. There is the heat within the hidden being, fallen being, which is moving the whole nature forward to its goal, to its self-awareness. And because of this Agni present within this inconscient nature, the evolution is taking place. We will then later clarify these things. There are many details which are different from this presentation. Here, this presentation is the first principle to understand the duality and where it is coming, what is the purpose of this darkness and light and their play. So this is the picture which Huta made of this avatar who entered the depth of the inconscient and lay down at the bottom of it. It's a mythological, beautiful picture. And because of its presence there, the whole nature is evolving and sustaining itself. So Sri Aurobindo says in the synthesis, a soul of the divine is here slowly awakening out of its involution and concealment in the material inconscience. So there is a soul within the inconscience, in the material inconscience of nature. There is the divine being there, and because of that divine being, everything is evolving. Here is a beautiful passage from Savitri which explains this thing, evolution. He sleeps in the atom and the burning star. He sleeps in man and God and beast and stone. Because he is there, the inconscient does its work. Because he is there, the world forgets to die. The world which is not, which has to die, which had to die, forgets to die. Just forgets, you know. So it goes on and on without kind of forgetting to die. It is dying and dying and dying all the time and forgetting to finally die.
So beautiful.
Because he is there. And he is in everything, in the burning star, in atom, in God and man and stone and beast, and everything does its work. The evolution, the nature goes on doing its work because he is there, and not because it's an illusion. So, and here we have very interesting Sri Aurobindo's explanation of this double process of terrestrial evolution of nature. He says that there is an outward visible process of physical evolution with birth as its machinery, so we are born and born again and again, and each evolved form of body housing its own evolved power of consciousness is maintained and kept in continuity by heredity. So this principle of heredity, so we have children who have children who have children, and so on and so forth. We pass our genetic code. That's what we consider to be evolution today, yes, according to Darwin. But there is other simultaneous processes, he says. There is at the same time an invisible process of soul evolution with rebirth into ascending grades of form and consciousness as its machinery. So on one hand, we have this uninterrupted evolution of the body, physical body, physicality, which is housing all the powers of consciousness, so to say, through our genetic matrix, so to say. And other is this rebirth of the soul, which is coming and going, picking up with this body. And both are evolving. Both are evolving. And this is very interesting. Then it makes totally sense. Now, for the first time, I could understand what evolution is about, why it is going on. My soul, for example, came into this body, which was prepared by me many thousand years back. So I was there before, who created certain, so to say, grandparents of myself that time, and passed that information forward and came now and picked it up again. And now I will pass my genetic code forward, and after 1,000 years will be again coming back in the future into that body which I am preparing now. So in time, basically, I am born to myself in time, if I stretch that, yes? Through many, so to say, we are working together, many souls, preparing for ourselves the instrument of embodiment. And by that we are also evolving as souls. We are not beings which are not evolving. We are the beings which are evolving. Yes, this is an important part. The true being, says Sri Aurobindo, may be realized in one or both of two aspects: the self, or Atman, and the soul, or Antaratman, psychic being as he calls it, Chaitya Purusha, this Angushthamatra Purusha, yes? The man in the heart with the size of the thumb. So there is one self which is above the head, unborn self, and there is other self which is within the heart, born self, so to say, the projection of that unborn self. So the difference is that one is felt as universal, the other as individual, supporting mind, life and body. So the unborn self is felt as universal, witness, uninvolved, detached, disinterested, yes? And individual is within the heart, very different feeling, very different experience. When one first realizes the Atman, one feels it separate from all things, existing in itself, and detached. When one realizes the psychic being within the heart, it is not like that. For this brings the sense of union with the divine, and dependence upon it, and soul consecration to the divine alone, and the power to change the nature and discover the true mental, the true vital, and the true physical being in oneself. Both realizations are necessary for this yoga. Now, this is a fundamental knowledge without which we cannot understand the Veda, and I cannot understand at all Upanishads in that depth what I would like us to have. So there are two types of consciousness within ourselves, two divine beings present, so to say. One is the projection of another, one is the unborn self, and the other is that which is embodied through reincarnation, which is coming here as the self being born in this body, in this mind, vital and body. Otherwise reincarnation would not take place. If only unborn self will stay there, that would not bring us to this manifestation of the divine. So here we have a very interesting new view on what is really happening to us. Now, in Indian tradition, this Angushthamatra Purusha or Chaitya Purusha was always underestimated. Most probably it is because of other great realizations and experiences, such as nirvana, or samadhi, or dhyana. There are many experiences you may have, all kind of occult powers, but Chaitya Purusha, this kind of Angushthamatra, this Vamana Purusha, this who is in the heart present, was known, always known, but not much said about it. Chaitanya speaks about it more, and in the period of Bhakti we have it more and more, so to say, spoken about. But before, it was more about nirvana, about realization of Brahman, of impersonal Brahman, nirguna Brahman, silent self, and so on and so forth. Self-realization, unborn self. And not much of this born self, not much. Those of us who studied Indian tradition in detail, we know this. It is true what I say. It is really so. you will not find much of evidence of this Chaitya Purusha. It is recognized, it is acknowledged, but not much technique or psychology or yoga is made around it. Yeah? And there is a reason for it. Mother says that this Chaitya Purusha, this psychic being, is evolving in time. And in the Vedas, it is hardly mentioned. It is only in the form of the psychic presence rather than the being. So for this being to be born as an individual being, the time is needed. It's evolving, as Sri Aurobindo says. This projection of the unborn self, which is reincarnated here, is evolving. It is learning to create its own immortal being within mortality. It wants to sustain itself here with these instruments. This is the fundamental knowledge which Sri Aurobindo brings, and nobody actually else is mentioning it. Maybe a little bit of Kashmiri and Shaivism. They are very close to Sri Aurobindo in a way. The first creation was the fall of the spirit, which laid out the field for its future manifestation. All the levels of consciousness were unfolded gradually, creating all the worlds in the involutionary order, from the light to the darkness, from the superconscient to the inconscient, from spirit to matter. So to say, the whole spectrum of all possible levels of being. I skipped Brahman and Atman, but if I come back you will see Satchit, Ananda, Vijnana, Manas, Prana and Annam. These are the grades of this first creation. And the second creation was a plunge of the Supreme into the darkness of material and conscience, bringing the aspect of the self into existence in terms of individual growth and realization. Here we have, for the first time, building up a true individual. From this point, matter becomes animated and the evolution takes place. It goes on till the psychic being is fully individualized. This presence in the heart is totally individualized and formed, and the instruments of its expression, body, life and mind, all our nature, all the instruments of nature, are fully developed to embody the spirit. Now here we have a technique of that very thing which I was asking you at the beginning. Are you sure that he wanted to be many only to play with? Or he really wanted to be many? Now, if this is true, what I'm saying now, that the psychic being is evolving, that the presence of this unborn self within the nature, in time and space, is evolving, then this is what he becomes. He grows. This is the child, the divine child, the luminous flame, that who will be born the eternal child within the nature, the immortal being. If it is true, then the individual is the way of manifesting the Supreme. Now, can you imagine that he who alone is now will be in every individual? Can you imagine the richness of his relations with himself now? It's incredible, that infinity of the detailed, how to say, individual manifestation in matter, what we were mentioning, that there are no identical leaves, no identical fingerprints or pebbles in the ocean, there are no identical forms of anything. There are no identical, there's these snowflakes. You will not find two identical snowflakes. And in the same way, there will be no two identical supremes. Can you imagine that? The richness and the infinity of this thought, it's bursting me from within, with happiness. There will be so much delight and ananda in everything. So this is the meaning of this creation. This is a real meaning. And Sri Aurobindo brings one more very interesting thing, the third creation. It is the supramental descent or supramental manifestation which reconciles nature with the soul. Now we have a contradiction between the nature, our nature of the physical, vital and mental nature, with our soul. They are in constant contradiction. So to reconcile them, there will be one more descent, which enthrones the psychic being, the evolved prince of this creation. There are many of them. We are all princes and princesses in this world. And it enthrones it as the Lord of this creation and gives it a direct access to the higher realms of being and consciousness, to the transcendental realms, establishing the law of the spirit in the whole nature. So the whole nature becomes now a representative of that transcendental spirit, where he is many, where every individual is this supreme in its totality of powers and possibilities and consciousness and being. So basically I will stop here. I will not speak about three transformations which Sri Aurobindo proposes, but because it's already enough for today, I wanted you to have a principal look first time what is this multitudinous and what is that oneness and where it comes from and what for. If I could bring it a little closer to this kind of even question, I would succeed. If it was helpful.
It's very clear. I think it's very, very clear. It was a beautiful presentation.
I'm glad.
I think every time, you've done this once in a group, and then you and I went through this once, and now you've done it again. And I just have to say, Vladimir, that every time you go through it, there's something else that comes forward, that it didn't quite connect before. To me, it's so rich. It really takes a lot of thought, and at least for me, a lot of thought and time to come together. And what I'm so interested in seeing is how this profile described much in Sri Aurobindo's terms, how it shows in the various verses of the Rig Veda, where there'll be glimpses of this here and there that we can see this vision, this Vedic vision come through. But it's very rich, and I will go through it countless times just trying to glean from it. But I know, Julia, you have a much deeper background in all this than I do. So all of this to me was like seeing it for the first time and thinking about it for the first time and really letting it kind of sink in, if you will.